The Little Lemon restaurant is becoming very popular in their local area, so much so that a second Little Lemon restaurant opened in another nearby area. Because of this, they want to update their online booking form. They've also added some new table sizes to the restaurant, so they want to replace the table size field on the form with a field for the number of people instead. They also don't need the table location field anymore. And finally, they want customers to be able to choose which restaurant they want to book at. The owners of the restaurant hope for continued success and growth of the business, so the form should allow for more restaurant locations to be added as the business expands. To make all these improvements to the booking form, you'll need to learn how to add advanced HTML features to a form. And that is exactly what this video will cover. Let's explore how to add the calendar, range and data list input types. I open booking.html in Visual Studio Code. I'll start by deleting the previous table and location fields. I then add 3 div elements for the new fields. Next, I'll add the field for the booking date. Luckily, HTML provides a built-in field type called date that will present a calendar to the customer when the field is clicked. To add this, I add an input element to the first div element and set its type attribute to date. I also set the ID and name attributes to booking_date. To provide a good user experience, I'll add a label element before the input element. Inside the label element, I add the text description, booking date. I also add the for attribute and set its value to booking_date so that accessibility software can describe the purpose of the input field to its users. Next, I'll add the field for the number of people. The restaurant has told me that the maximum booking is 10 people, so I'll use the range input type. The range input type allows me to specify the minimum and maximum values of the field. I add an input element to the second div element. I set its type attribute to range. I also set its ID and name attributes to booking_people. To set the minimum value, I add the attribute min, which is short for minimum, and set its value to 1. Then, to set the maximum value, I add the attribute max, which is short for maximum, and set its value to 10. Since a 4-person booking is the most common, I'll set the value attribute to 4 so that it will be set to 4 when the form initially loads. But a slider isn't much use without displaying its value. I add an output element after the input element and set its text content to 4 to match the default value of the input element. The output element is a semantic HTML element that contains a result of a calculation. In this case, I want it to display the value of the slider. To do this, I'll add a small piece of JavaScript code to the input element. I add the onInput attribute and set its value to this.nextElement sibling.value equals this.value. This small piece of code will update the output element with the value of the slider when it changes. Again, to provide a good user experience, I add a label before the element and set its content to number of people. I then set the for attribute to booking_people. Now I'll add the new location field. The restaurant currently has 2 locations, but they said they might add more later. To allow for expansion later, I'll use a data list input type. The data list input type allows me to specify a list of available options that will appear in a drop-down list. There can be tens and hundreds of options, so the field allows the user to begin typing and it will narrow down the available options based on their input. Since there are only 2 locations so far, the customer will be able to select their location from the drop-down list. When more locations are added later, the customer will be able to begin typing their location and quickly select their location from a reduced set of options. Setting up the data list input type requires a few more steps than the other input types. First, I add an input element. Then I set the name and ID attributes to booking_location. Then I add an attribute called list and set its value to locations. This value is important for the next step. I then add a data list element and set the ID attribute to match the value of the list attribute on the input element. In this case, I set the ID attribute to locations. Inside the data list element, I then add 2 option elements. On the first option element, I add the value attribute and set it to downtown. On the second option element, I add the value attribute and set it to uptown. Again, to provide a good user experience, I add a label before the input element and set its content to location. I then set the for attribute to booking_location. I save the file and open it in live preview. When I click on the date field, the browser opens a calendar and allows me to select a date. The range input type is presented as a slider that I can slide left and right to the value I want. And finally, the data list input allows me to select an option for the location or begin typing to narrow down the available options. With the continued success of Little Lemon, I'm sure I'll be updating this form again in the near future. In this video, you've learned how to use advanced features of HTML forms. You should now be able to add a calendar, create a slider with values, and add a data list that allows users to either select an option from a drop-down list or by typing their input.